Montana Territory, spring of 1871. The wind cut through the Bitterroot Mountains like a blade, raw and sharp, and Noelle Ashby rode straight into it with nothing but a rifle on her back and betrayal burning in her chest. Her mare, Dove, was lathered and trembling, but Noelle kept her moving. She had to. There was no going back to what she had before, not after what Clara did. They had been best friends since childhood, raised on neighboring homesteads near the edge of the timberline. Clara's laugh had once been the sound of home. Now, it echoed hollow in Noelle's mind, the same voice that whispered to those men where to find her father's gold stash, the same voice that did not warn her before they came. Noelle had returned from the trading post to find her father dead, the cabin ransacked, and Clara riding off with those men like she belonged to them. She did not cry. She had not cried since. Now, 3 days into her ride, the snow was thinning into mud and the trees opened to a wide stretch of dry prairie. She was out of the mountains, but she was not safe. She had no money, no family left, and nowhere to go. She pulled Dove to a stop at a fork in the trail. Her hands were raw from the rains, her lips cracked from wind and silence. She looked down both paths. One led east toward Helena. The other stretched south toward the open country where no one knew her name. That was when she heard the hoofbeats. She spun Dove around, rifle up, heart hammering. A lone rider crested the hill behind her, tall in the saddle, dust trailing behind his horse. He saw her, slowed, he raised one hand, palm out. "I ain't here to hurt you," he called. Noelle kept the rifle steady. "You know Clara Harrow?" The man shook his head. "No, ma'am." "Just saw your horse's tracks, thought you might need help." She studied him. He was young, early 20s, maybe with dark brown hair curled under the brim of his hat and a long coat that hung heavy with trail dust. His voice was low, calm. He made no move toward his gun. "You lost?" he asked. "No," she said, lowering the rifle an inch. "I am running." He nodded like that made sense. "Name's Vaughn Zemler. I'm heading south. There is a ranch a day's ride out that might offer you a bed and a meal if you want company." Noelle hesitated. She had trusted one friend and paid dearly. But Vaughn's eyes held no trick in them, just weariness. She looked down the south trail, then back at him. "I will ride beside you," she said. He gave a small nod. "Then I will not stray." They rode in silence for a time, the wind shifting behind them. Vaughn kept a steady pace, careful not to crowd her. When Dove stumbled on a loose stone, he reached over and steadied her by the reins without a word, then let go. By mid-afternoon, the sun warmed the backs of their coats and the hills rolled soft around them. She caught him watching her once, not like a man looking at a woman, but like someone trying to understand a puzzle. "You run from something or to something?" she asked finally. Vaughn took a while before answering. "Both." That was all he said. By nightfall, they found a dry patch of grass beneath the stars and made camp. Vaughn gathered wood while Noelle tied Dove and unsaddled her. They sat on opposite sides of the fire, sharing jerky and silence. "Used to be 5 of us," Vaughn said, voice quiet. "My brothers and me. Then the war happened, then the fever, now it is just me." Noelle looked at him through the firelight. "I am sorry." He shrugged like it weighed too much to carry any other way. My father was all I had. I buried him alone. His oldest friend helped put the shovel in the ground, then stole everything we had and left me to die." Vaughn's jaw tightened. He looked toward the fire, then back at her. "You are not alone anymore." Noelle swallowed hard and looked away. She did not want kindness. She wanted the ache in her chest to stop, but still, the words settled something in her. Like a stone she had carried a long way, finally laid down. They rode again at first light. The trail was easier now. Vaughn told her about the land ahead, the rivers that ran slow, the ranchers who kept to themselves, the horses that roamed wild in the south. His voice was steady, a comfort against the ache in her ribs. He was always just close enough to reach her if she fell, and far enough to let her breathe. 2 days later, they reached the ranch, a wide stretch of land nestled against the hills, with cattle grazing and smoke curling from the chimney of the bunkhouse. Vaughn rode ahead and spoke to the foreman. Noelle waited by the gate, heart pounding. The man came back with a nod. "They said you can stay if you help with the cooking. They are short a hand." Noelle let out a breath she did not know she had been holding. "I can work." The next weeks passed in a rhythm she had never known: quiet mornings, long days, shared meals. Noel cooked, helped mend shirts, and learned the names of the ranch hands. Vaughn worked with the horses, always steady, always near. Some nights they sat under the stars and said nothing at all, but the silence between them was not empty anymore. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned gold, Vaughn found her out by the paddock watching the horses run. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked. He leaned on the fence beside her. "Used to, now I think about staying." She looked at him then, really looked. Vaughn turned to meet her eyes. "You are strong, Noel, and you are still standing after all that." She felt her throat tighten. "I do not want to be alone anymore." "You are not," he said. Then he reached out and touched her hand. She did not pull away. For the first time in weeks, she closed her eyes and let herself feel it: the warmth of his skin, the steadiness in his voice, the way he never once looked at her like she was broken. Noel opened her eyes. "You sure about this?" Vaughn nodded. "I will ride beside you, Noel. And I will never stray." She took his hand fully in hers, and for the first time since her world fell apart, she believed him. By early summer, the land had softened. Rain came in slow, soaking spells that made the soil rich and dark, coaxing green from the hills and wildflowers from the gullies. The ranch took on a quieter rhythm after branding season passed, and Noel found herself falling into the pace of it without resistance. She had taken to rising before the rooster, hands already working before the sky broke. The kitchen stove gave off a gentle heat. She had grown to rely on nothing fierce, just steady. She liked that kind of warmth now. Vaughn rode out most mornings with two other hands, checking fence lines and keeping an eye on strays. He came back dust-covered, lean in the saddle, and always glanced toward the cookhouse where she might be stringing beans or wiping flour off her hands. One afternoon, she carried a tin basin out to the pump behind the bunkhouse, her skirts hitched and sleeves rolled. The water came up cold, sending a shiver over her arms. Vaughn passed by leading a sorrel gelding, its leg wrapped in burlap. "He lame?" she asked, wiping her hands dry on her apron. "Stepped in a hole chasing off a coyote." "Not broke, just sore," Vaughn said, tying the reins to a post. "You ever wrap a leg that thick before?" "I wrapped my father's ribs once after a mule kicked him into the smokehouse wall. Took 3 days before he could stand straight again." "That's so." Vaughn's mouth lifted slightly, but not in jest. "You carry a lot." Noel glanced at the horse. "We all do." He watched her a moment longer, then nodded and walked the gelding toward the shade. She felt the echo of his gaze even after he turned away. That evening, the ranch owner's wife invited her to sit a spell on the porch after supper. The woman, Mrs. Alden, had a quiet way of speaking, measured, like she didn't waste words unless they were worth saying. "You keep to yourself, Miss Ashby," she said, shelling peas with practiced fingers. "I've never had reason not to," Noel replied, folding her hands in her lap. "Maybe. But I seen the way you listen. That's rare." Noel looked down at the boards beneath her feet. "It's easier sometimes to listen than to speak." Mrs. Alden didn't argue. She just handed her a fresh pod and let the silence settle between them. It wasn't unpleasant. When Noel finally stood to leave, Mrs. Alden said, "That Zemler boy, he watches you like he's waiting for something to grow." Noel didn't answer, but her steps back to the bunkhouse were slower than usual. The next morning, she brought coffee outside to where Vaughn sat oiling his saddle straps. She handed him a tin cup and sat beside him on the edge of the wooden platform. "You ever live in a place longer than a season?" she asked. "A few times," Vaughn said, sipping. "But never where I wanted to stay. What makes this place different?" He rubbed a thumb over the leather's worn edge. "Maybe it's not the place." Noel let that sit between them. She watched the morning sun stretch across the corral, warming the dust into light. "I don't know what comes next," she said finally. Vaughn nodded once. "You don't have to." Later that week, a storm rolled in from the west, the kind that built slow, with a sky like iron and a wind that carried the smell of wet earth before a drop ever fell. Vaughn was out mending a gate when it hit. Noel waited past dusk, eyes on the horizon. When he finally rode in, soaked to the bone and shivering, she met him at the barn with a lantern and a dry coat. "You look like a drowned dog," she said, taking his reins. Feel worse than one, he muttered, blinking against the light. Inside the tack room, she helped him hang his coat and fetch a towel. He didn't speak while she worked, but his eyes followed her every movement. You didn't have to wait, he said as she lit the stove in the corner. I did anyway. He looked at her then, full and plain, like he had been holding something back for too long. I think about you when I'm out there, he said. Not just today, most days. Noelle didn't flinch. She stepped closer, close enough to hear the water drip from his hair to the floor. I don't want promises, she said. Not yet. I'm not offering one, he said, voice low, just telling you what already is. She reached for his hand. It was cold, rough with callus, but her fingers closed around it all the same. They stood like that, quiet, while the rain drummed steady on the roof above. Nothing spoken after that. Nothing needed. By the time the storm passed, the land had changed again. Softer, greener, and so had she. The hayloft smelled of clover and horsehair, warm and still from the late summer sun. Noelle leaned against the beam above the ladder, her skirts dusted with straw, watching Vaughn fit a new latch to the trapdoor. His sleeves were rolled, forearms marked with flecks of rust and wood shavings, the muscles in his hands working careful and sure. You always fix things that aren't broke, she asked, brushing hay from her sleeve. Vaughn didn't look up. Not broke, just weak, figured better to catch it now than fall through come winter. She tilted her head. That how you see most things? He glanced at her then, eyes steady. If I can mend something before it gives, I will. She let that settle between them, then walked to the edge of the loft and looked out across the pasture. The wheat fields shimmered gold in the distance, and the sound of a windmill creaked down from the ridge. She hadn't seen Clara's face in her mind for days now, not since before the storm. I got offered money this morning, she said without turning. A drifter passing through said he'd pay me to cook for a mining camp near Deer Lodge. Said I'd make more in 2 weeks than I do here in 2 months. Vaughn stopped working. You thinking about going? She let her hand rest on the window frame. I thought about what I'd do with the money, not the going part. He stood and wiped his hands on a rag, then crossed to where she stood. What would you do? Buy a mule, maybe some tools, build something small near the river. I've got my father's land grant papers still, 40 acres west of here. He always meant to settle it. Vaughn leaned beside her. You'd go alone. I've done near everything alone. He didn't speak again right away, just looked out over the land with her, the weight of the question between them. I've been saving, he said finally. Not much, but enough to start something. I never knew where before. Noelle turned, watching him. You offering to build on my land. I'm offering to build with you, he said. If you want that, her breath caught not from surprise, but from how easy it felt to believe him. She studied the shape of his face, the way the quiet lived in his eyes like it had roots. He wasn't a man who filled silence to be heard. He filled it only when it needed warmth. I've never built anything that lasted, she said. Neither have I, he said. But I'd like to try. That night, she brought him a tin plate of cornbread and beans, and they ate under the cottonwood behind the barn. He peeled the bark from a twig while she talked about the river bend, the way it curved gentle around the edge of the grant. I'd put the house on the rise, she said. Where the sun hits first come morning. Horses could graze below. We'd need a fence line, he added, chewing thoughtfully. You any good with a saw? She asked. Decent. Better with a hammer. They talked until the stars came out, until the lanterns in the bunkhouse guttered low. When she stood to leave, he caught her hand not tight, just enough to still her. Noelle, she looked down at him. When I ride out with you, it won't be to pass time. It'll be for keeps. She didn't flinch. Then ride out with me. 2 weeks later, they left before dawn. The ranch foreman shook Vaughn's hand and handed Noelle a sack of dry goods. Mrs. Alden pressed a folded quilt into her arms without a word. There were no goodbyes spoken, just nods heavy with what had passed between them. They rode west, a pack mule trailing behind, the land opening wide and empty ahead. When they reached the river bend, the grass was tall and green and the soil dark beneath it. Noelle dismounted and walked the rise where the house would stand, the wind tugging at her hair. Vaughn followed her, silent. She turned to him. This where you want to stay? He didn't answer with words. He stepped forward, took her face in his hands and kissed her slow and sure, like he had waited his whole life to be certain of something. When they pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his. "I never thought peace would feel like this." He smiled, warm and quiet. "It does with you." And it did. Through the months that followed the building, the sweat, the long days and longer nights, they built not just walls and a roof, but a life threaded with laughter, shared silence, and the kind of trust that doesn't fray. Noelle never rode alone again. Vaughn never once turned back. They stayed, together. And that made all the difference. The first frost came early that autumn. It silvered the grass in the hollows before dawn and left thin ice on the water barrel by the porch. Noelle wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stepped outside, breath misting in the morning air. A crow called from the cottonwood, and the mule brayed low from the lean-to Vaughn had built beside the tack shed. She crossed the yard with a bucket in hand, boots crunching over cold soil. They had been on the land nearly 3 months by then, and the house, though not yet complete, stood tall against the hillside. The roof was on, the chimney held smoke, and inside it was dry and warm enough to sleep without waking stiff. Vaughn was near the river, driving fence posts into the north line. She could see the rise and fall of his shoulders even from a distance, the rhythm of his work unhurried, measured. She watched him a moment, then turned toward the garden beds they had carved from the earth near the slope. The squash had taken root, and the last of the beans clung stubbornly to their vines. Later, she carried 2 baskets inside, hands chilled, cheeks flushed. Vaughn stepped in behind her, shaking dust from his hat. "That new line'll hold through winter," he said, hanging his coat by the door. "We'll have to bring the mule in closer come December, though. Snow'll run deep in the low spots." Noelle set the baskets on the table, brushing a strand of hair from her brow. "I can stitch a second blanket for her stall. There's wool left from what Mrs. Alden gave us." He moved toward the stove, poured water from the kettle into the basin, then paused. "You ever think about going back to town, just for a day?" She looked up from the beans. "To Helena," he nodded. "I don't know what I'd do there now. That place don't hold anything good." Vaughn dried his hands on a rag, then leaned against the counter. "There's a man there, name of Jeb Calling. He's got a claim office. I wrote him last month, asked if your father's grant could be registered clean." Noelle's hands stilled. "You did that?" "I wanted to be sure we were building on more than dirt." She stared at him, the weight of what he'd done spreading quiet through her chest. "His reply came 2 days ago," Vaughn continued. "Said your father's deed was valid. No one's contested it, but he needs your mark on the final line." Noelle folded the rag on the table, her fingers slow. "I'll ride in with you," Vaughn added. She looked at him then. "You didn't tell me before because you didn't want to push. I didn't tell you before because I wanted you to choose it." That afternoon, they packed light. She tied a ribbon around the rolled deed and tucked it into her satchel. Vaughn saddled the horses while she wrapped bread and dried apples into a cloth. They left just as the sun cut through the clouds, the road packed firm from the cold. The ride into Helena took the better part of the next day. The town hadn't changed much since she last saw it. Dusty streets, low chatter outside the smithy, the smell of coal smoke and horse sweat. But it didn't rise in her like it once had. None of it reached past her ribs. They dismounted near the claim office, a narrow building with a striped awning and a bell above the door. Vaughn held it open and she stepped inside. The clerk looked up, then stood when he saw her name on the paper she slid across the desk. "Ashby," he asked. She nodded and he handed her a pen. She signed. Outside, the wind had picked up. She pulled her shawl close, then looked up at Vaughn. "It's mine now." "It's always been," he said. They stayed the night at a boarding house on the edge of town. The room was clean but sparse, a single bed, a wood stove, a basin with a cracked rim. Noelle laid her satchel on the chair and turned toward the window. "I didn't think I'd ever come back here," she said, voice quiet. Vaughn lit the lamp and set it on the table. "Sometimes going back ain't the same as going backward." She crossed the room, reached out and touched his arm. "I never knew what it meant to be safe until you rode beside me." He looked at her then, and she saw the weight of the trail, of choices made and not regretted, settle in his expression. "You don't have to know everything right off," he said. "You just have to know you're not alone in it." She leaned in, rested her brow against his chest. His arms came around her, careful at first, then sure. They stood like that for a long time, the air between them warm from the lamp and the hush of their breathing. Noelle closed her eyes and let the quiet hold her. In the morning, they would ride home. Their home. And this time, the wind would be at their backs. They returned to the river bend while the cottonwoods still held their yellow and the ground hadn't yet frozen deep. The ride back was quiet, but not heavy. Vaughn carried a coil of rope along his saddle horn, and Noelle kept her hand tucked at the base of her satchel, where the signed deed lay folded beneath a strip of linen. When they reached the rise, the house stood waiting in its frame of rough-cut pine, the windows catching the slant light like open eyes. Smoke drifted from the chimney. Nothing had changed, but everything felt claimed. That evening, she unpacked the small parcel she had bought in Helena, a tin of lye soap, 2 lengths of cotton for curtains, and a stack of paper tied with string. Vaughn set the carpenter's square on the table beside her, and when their hands brushed, she didn't pull away. "I've been thinking about the slope behind the barn," he said, unrolling a scrap of canvas onto the table. "There's spring runoff that cuts through it come thaw. We'll need a trench or it'll take out the back fence." She nodded, tracing the line he'd drawn with her finger. "We could lay stone. Leave a channel through the middle, pack earth tight around the sides." Vaughn leaned closer, the lantern casting gold across his jaw. "You know that work, I learned from watching." "And digging," she looked at him, then added, "I'd rather do it together." He didn't answer right away, but when he did, it was soft. "I don't want to build anything without you in it." Snow came late that year. The first flurries didn't stick, but by December, the ground wore a white coat that softened every edge. The hearth burned nearly round the clock, and Noelle kept her hands busy stitching curtains and mending the seams of Vaughn's winter coat. He took to carving small lengths of wood in the evenings, not for use, just for the shape of it. She watched him sometimes, her gaze resting easy on his hands. One night, as the wind pressed hard against the shutters, he set his carving knife down and turned to her. "You ever think about what kind of life you want?" he asked. She folded the corner of her quilt square and set it aside. "Not until I knew I could have one." And now she met his eyes. "I want mornings that begin quiet. I want to plant seeds I'll live long enough to harvest. I want a name to give to what we are." He stood, crossed to her, and knelt beside her chair. "Then marry me." The words weren't dramatic, they didn't float or ring, they grounded themselves between them like stones in water. She reached for his hand. "Yes." They wed beneath the cottonwood in the thaw of March with only the Aldens and 2 ranch hands in attendance. Mrs. Alden brought a Bible and a small braid of dried flowers. Vaughn wore his best shirt, and Noelle wore the same shawl she'd ridden in with, hem stitched clean for the day. Afterward, they shared bread and cider on the porch. Vaughn kept his hand over hers the whole time, his thumb tracing the edge of her knuckles in slow, familiar rhythm. She didn't speak much, but not from nerves. She simply didn't need to. Spring soaked the land with new life. The trench behind the barn held firm, and they built a henhouse near the eastern fence. Noelle kept a ledger now, marking seed dates and rainfall. Vaughn taught her to split rails for fencing. In the evenings, they read aloud mostly old farm almanacs and the occasional dog-eared novel passed down from the Aldens. One morning, she woke before dawn, the sky outside still bruised with sleep. She lay quiet beside Vaughn, his breath slow, arm draped over her waist. Her hand rested on her belly, where a new weight had begun to grow. She waited until the fire was lit and the coffee boiled before she told him. "There's something coming," she murmured, her voice low. He looked up from the kindling, his expression steady. She moved his hand to her stomach. After a pause, his mouth twitched not a grin, but something fuller. He rested his forehead against hers. "I'll build the cradle." The months passed steady. Her body changed, and he changed with it. He spoke softer now, touched her shoulder in passing more often. When the baby came a girl, strong, lunged, and red-cheeked, they named her Mira, after Vaughn's mother. Noelle held her close that first night, her hair damp with sweat, Vaughn's arms around them both. The cradle stood beneath the window, carved with a single wildflower at the head. Vaughn had shaped it from the same pine as the house. Years settled into their bones without rust. The orchard they planted bore fruit by the third summer. Mira grew quick, bold in the way children are when they're born into safety. She learned to walk between rows of beans, hands out like wings. Vaughn built her a stool to reach the basin, and Noel taught her letters with bits of chalk on the hearthstone. One night, after Mira had fallen asleep and the fire had died low, Noel sat beside Vaughn on the porch, the stars sharp above them. "You remember the day you offered to ride beside me?" she asked. "I do." She turned, pressing her cheek to his shoulder. "You never strayed." He kissed her temple, slow. "You never turned away." They stayed like that, the two of them wrapped in the kind of quiet that doesn't need filling. Behind them, the house stood solid, the cradle still, the fire banked low for morning. And that was their life. Built from ruin, shaped by hands that held on, and carried forward by the quiet kind of love that lasts.